30 years ago, I heard the term paradigm. Then I heard paradigm shift, paradigm paralysis, and paradigm pioneer when I read Joel Barker's book, Paradigm, The Business of Discovering the Future. Now, it's not a fortune teller book. I think today we would call that strategic planning, but certainly discovering the future sounds a lot sexier. A paradigm, if you're not familiar with that term, is not a pair of dimes, so two coins, although that might help you remember the word as it did when I learned it 30 years ago. But a paradigm is the way we see things. It's like our lens. So the way I look at things or the way you look at things based on your environment or your exposure or perhaps your experience or beliefs or the culture in which you live or work. It can even depend on your personality type or maybe how stubborn you are or not. Most of us are familiar with the term paradigm, but we only softly understand the power of paradigms. Barker's definition of a paradigm is it's a set of rules and regulations, both written or unwritten, that does two things. It defines and establishes boundaries, and then it tells us how to behave within those boundaries in order to be successful. The problem with paradigms is that sometimes our paradigm becomes the paradigm. And that's what causes great risk, both to to ourselves, to our family, to our children, to our companies, to our communities. And that could even be risky to our own nation. So in chapter 1 of Barker's book, the very first words that he penned, he told a very eye-opening, a very real, and a very scary story about Switzerland in 1968. You see, for decades, almost a century, the Swiss dominated the world in watchmaking. Anyone who wanted a good watch, an accurate watch, bought a Swiss watch. And they were constantly improving their game. In fact, it was the Swiss who invented the second hand and the minute hand. They were the ones that invented the gears and the bearings and the main springs, easy for me to say, on self-winding watches. They were always bringing their best game to the table. They were very similar to the Apple of today. By 1968, they enjoyed 65% of the world's market share and 80% of the world's profit. So a lot of people think, well, of course, if they have the most sales, they'll have the highest profit. But actually, that's not always the case. So they were in this sweet spot of selling the most and making the most money. Yet, by 1980, their market share collapsed. They went from 65% of market share to less than 10. They went from 80% of profits to less than 20. What happened? They ran into a paradigm shift. The shift was a fundamental rule change in watchmaking. Let me pause here. Have you been through a fundamental rule change lately? I think that you and I are painfully aware of a major paradigm change recently. How about, or rule change recently? How about stay at home, shelter in place? That sounds like the end of the world or a scary movie. How about schools are closed? And hey, good luck, parents, with that homeschooling. I know parents who said they didn't go to college to be a teacher on purpose. And what about churches closing because they weren't essential businesses while bars and abortion clinics could remain open? I heard a national expert and physician warn the President of the United States on national TV that the scariest place, the most dangerous place to be in our country was a hospital. Now she's in my world. Now let me tell you this, people died because of that. People were afraid to go to the hospital and had heart attacks and strokes, or they didn't tend to their illnesses because they were afraid to go to the most dangerous place in our country. We went through a toilet paper shortage. You can't go with your family to a hospital. That is a fundamental rule change. I mean, just several months ago, the family was part of the care team, right? We have in our family a rule, no man left behind. I'm generally the one that does the overnight shift because I have to work by day. Or I get to work by day, but I stay there overnight. But to be a part of the care team, I'm a bean counter. I'm not a clinician. The rest of my family are clinicians. So that's hard for me, but I was a trooper and was part of the care team for my family. And after the rule change, we weren't even allowed to be at the hospital with our family. And then what about our parents or our loved ones who are in nursing homes or retirement centers? We are their lifeline, but the rule changed. We weren't allowed there. So it was like air and us, and they had to get rid of us. So we have been through a lot of fundamental rule changes lately. So we can definitely relate to this story today. So just like us pre-pandemic, the Swiss were just doing what they were good at, making watches with gears and bearings and mainsprings until that way was irrelevant. The old mechanical mechanism was about to give way to electronics. And between the years 1979 and 1981, 50,000 of the 65,000 watchmakers lost their job. That's 80%. In a country or a nation as small as Switzerland, that was a national catastrophe. But for another nation, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. The irony here is that this story about the Swiss and this devastation, this situation was completely, hang on now, hang on, everybody listening? It was completely avoidable. You see, it was the Swiss themselves that invented that new electronic quartz movement watch in their own laboratory. And when they took this invention to the Swiss manufacturers, they dismissed it. They said there was no way that anyone would take that watch serious. They even called it a toy-like invention. So they dismissed it, or better yet, they completely missed it. Why? Because it didn't fit into their paradigm. Anybody coming to life here and feeling this pain? This invention didn't fit their paradigm because it required almost no gears. It was battery operated. It was electronic. They thought it couldn't possibly be the watch of the future. They were paralyzed by their own old thinking paradigm. Their paradigm became the paradigm for an entire nation, an entire industry. In fact, they were so sure of their decision that they allowed their researchers to take this unpatented invention to the World Watch Congress, where they laid it on the table. Seiko of Japan took one look at it, and the rest is history. How can we avoid the mistake that the Swiss made? You know, we have witnessed and experienced a monumental paradigm shift, which reminded me of the scariest quote in this entire book that Barker wrote. He said, when a paradigm shifts, everything goes back to zero. Your past success means nothing. So let me give you some examples. Working in the healthcare business, what used to be a surgery changed to a X-ray. And then what used to be an X-ray changed to a pill. So we went from a surgeon to a radiologist to big pharma. So it didn't matter whether you were the best surgeon on the planet. You were the most successful surgeon on the planet. It wasn't a surgery anymore. And the same with X-ray. So that's what we talk about when we say when a paradigm shifts, everything goes back to zero. Your past success means nothing. That shift, it was good for Japan. This shift that we're going through right now, it can be good for you. It can be good for me. It can be good for us. It can be good for our church. It can be good for our nation. Since we can't avoid most earthly paradigm shifts, we certainly couldn't avoid the one that hit us recently. What we can do and what does matter is how we respond to it. What we do now, how we respond now. We can either become paralyzed or become pioneers. So how do we know if we're inflicted with paradigm paralysis? We'll take a look at some of these clues. Maybe you've heard them said. Maybe you've said them yourself or thought them. How about, that's impossible? We don't do things like that around here. We've always done it that way. I wish it were that easy. It's against policy. It's too radical of a change for us. We've tried something like that before and it didn't work. Hey, when you've been around here a little longer, you'll understand. No, you know what? I won't understand. And neither would you if you were able to take a step back and open up your view to see it through a different vantage point. I think Henry Ford did a great job describing paradigm paralysis when he said this: if I asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses, right? Because they were saddled with the transportation paradigm of it had to have 4 legs instead of 4 wheels. The fact is, we manage within a paradigm, but we lead between paradigms. So leaders are called paradigm pioneers. So there are paradigm settlers and there are paradigm pioneers. Settlers ask, is it safe out there? What's the new norm? What's it going to look like? The sky is falling, the sky is falling. Where pioneers say, of course it's safe out there, because it's the pioneers that take the risk. They go out early. They make the new safe. They make the new better. So a paradigm pioneer's battle cry is those who say it can't be done. You need to get out of the way of those that are doing it. And I know many of you, that's your battle cry too. When you want to make something happen, you're ready to shake it up and let's get going, but you've got a lot of people in your way. So way before the devastation of the Swiss or in the 1980s or the destruction from the global pandemic of 2020, there were countless biblical stories, both disastrous and miraculous, about paradigm shifts. I mean, from the Old Testament stories, it was Adam who shifted the course for the entire human race, or Noah who became the only human a good human that God could find, who was positioned to survive a God-size shift on all humanity. It was God shifting the sea, making a way for Moses to lead out the Hebrew slaves out of Egypt. It was God orchestrating Joseph's shift from the pit to the palace. And it was God shifting Esther from poverty to royalty, positioning her to step in and save the nation. But best of all are the biblical shifts where God shifted from heaven. He came down to earth to save us. Jesus brought us the biggest shift by way of the best love story that ever existed. Jesus made up for all that was messed up. In a world where after a paradigm shifts, everything goes back to zero, our past success means nothing, Jesus flipped that shift principle right on its head. So instead of our past successes meaning nothing, he made it so that our past sins, our past mistakes, our past stupidity means nothing. Let me repeat that. Jesus' shift made a way for us in our sinful past. In fact, Psalms reminds us that he removes our sin as far as east is to the west. Now, a lot of people think, well, that's going to wrap around, so that's, definitely ends. It doesn't. He doesn't say from the east to the west around the planet Earth. He says from east to the west, so that's infinitely. That's how far away he removes our sins. So God gave us a Bible full of unshiftable promises. And I just want to share five of my go-to because I feel like it's relevant to this topic today. Number one, he is able to do exceedingly abundantly above and beyond more than we ask or think. A similar one, no eye has seen, no ear has heard, no mind can conceive the wonderful things God has in store for those who love him. And while the world may be shifting day to day, Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And we need to be brave because if God's for us, who can be against us? And in his hands are the depths of the earth. So we can rest knowing that regardless of which party holds office in this country, our God still holds this world. So today, I declare in the name of Jesus that God is going to bring a divine shift into your life. One touch of God's favor can thrust you 1,000 levels higher and can advance you 20 years into the future in your job, in your health, in your finances, in your relationships, in your abilities, your gifts, your talents, your destiny. In the book of Numbers, God shifted the winds. In the book of Joshua, God shifted the sun to stand still. In the book of Acts, God shifted Saul from a Christian bounty hunter. He looked for us and killed us and imprisoned us and tortured us to eventually becoming Apostle Paul, who wrote half of the New Testament. Paul had so many hardships, but you know what he said? All of his losses were nothing compared to what he gained in knowing Christ. When a divine shift occurs, it doesn't matter what your limitations are. What matters is how you respond and if you respond. So how will you respond to this divine shift that's coming your way? Well, are you going to be like the Swiss watch manufacturers and just unwilling to see beyond your own old paradigm and limitations? Are you going to believe the lies of the devil versus all the promises that he gave us in the Bible and the endless examples of his power? Are you going to be a paradigm settler and just hide out and miss out on a God-sized shift? Or are you going to be in a position like Noah, with an open heart and an open mind to receive the shift from God? Or are you going to honor God with your trust like Joshua did and believe God's shift will make the sun stop for you too? Or are you going to be like Paul and allow that shift to catapult you into your calling? When you honor God, He will take you beyond any limitation, any closed door, any lack of connections, lack of education or training, lack of money, income, or resources. You may not be able to change someone's mind about you, but Proverbs says God can change the hearts of kings. God can. So when God breathes in your direction, people's minds are changed. Closed doors are open. Old no's become yeses. Or the not now, they turn into let's do this. God will not allow any person to keep you from your destiny. Only you can do that. Let me repeat that. God will not allow any person to keep you from your destiny. Only you can do that. So while another person may be bigger, stronger, more powerful like Goliath, God knows how to shift things around and get you where you need to be. It's time for a shift. It may not look in the natural like it could be possible. We don't serve a natural God. We serve a supernatural God. Because you've honored Him, He's going to shift you in a position that was never attainable on your own. What should have taken 20 years to accomplish, God is going to shift for you in a second. So let's stand together on God's promises. Let's say it out loud. Let's memorize it. Go to my go-to. No eye has seen, no ear has heard, no mind can conceive the wonderful shifts God has in store for those who love Him. Remember, it's not what you know, it's who you know. And most importantly, who knows you. And that's Jesus. He knew you before you were born, and you are the apple of His eye. Call on Jesus. And then, get ready. A God shift is coming.